trend lines, I think, are absolutely in this direction. I think it's the right direction. It's just maybe moving slower than many people would like.
What are the implications of this for talent in the sector? And, I think, our audience cares about talent in our various companies and organizations. Are there trends around talent in the sector? I mean, clearly, this is going to call for different skill sets. It's going to call for investing in skills in different parts of the world. How do you think about that?
Yeah, there are definitely some trends. Some of the obvious ones that are easy to point to today are around financial engineering, right? So in the old aid industry, a civil engineer was kind of a very typical job description because we were building, we were going out and doing irrigation and bridges and right. And nowadays, most of the countries you're talking about have their own civil engineers. They have their own infrastructure companies. So if the African Development Bank puts out a bid for an infrastructure project, chances are the construction companies bidding on it are going to be from Turkey, from India, from Nigeria. There are, not in every developing country yet, but in many, especially middle income countries, there are robust infrastructure construction industries out there. Still, of course, many German and American and British are bidding and winning too, but it's a much more competitive space. The new kind of engineering skill that's needed is financial engineering, and that's because there's this idea that we're going away from just contracts and grants to much more complex instruments, things like development impact bonds, things like tiered funding that I mentioned before, or challenge grants. Blended finance is a term that's often used, and blending of public and private money. And so you need people who kind of understand the world of finance and are comfortable with business models and can understand the different risk profiles of different pools of money and different kinds of investors, can think about, how to structure something that might be a little bit complex, but that ultimately gets everyone to achieve the objectives that they might share, as well as the ones that are a little bit distinct. So that's an area that there's some growth in, but that's not going to be a huge number of jobs. It's a specialized skill set, but it's an example where I talk to leaders of NGOs and implementing organizations, and this is something they're constantly referring to. The team we have now, we know how to get funding through contracts and grants. We need a team that knows how to get funding through these other sources, and we don't have those people today. So that is a kind of talent question you hear, and maybe it's a microcosm of a broader issue, which is this is not a field where there was a lot of career switching between public and private sector. So there was a lot of switching within the aid industry. People might go from government to an NGO or back. But what's really needed now are people who come with business skills and who know the developing world. So business skills alone might not do it. But so there's this look for these kind of unicorn candidates now that really do a number of things. They understand the country where the work's going to happen. They maybe speak the language, but they might have an MBA and they might have done some private sector work. And they also understand the way that government aid agencies work or NGOs work. So they're not coming in as a total foreigner to this industry. So that's often the broad challenge you see now is this need for private sector. We do a survey every year of recruiters in our industry, and we found people with an MBA that was the most sought after degree actually right now.
What about tech and data science? Hunger for that in just in the commercial world. And we're also going to hear in the series from people who are building tech skills and app factories in parts of Africa, and sort of in a sort of job retraining sort of context. Are they desperately sought for skills as well?
They are, yeah, they are, and it's still early going. But I talk in the book, for example, about a company called Simprints, and they're basically specialized in taking fingerprints and other kinds of biometric ID, including voice, face, full hands. And they're developing this amazing technology where you can fingerprint or take a handprint of a baby and track that and still when they're an adult know that it was that baby. And so for programs like vaccination efforts in countries, these are hugely important systems. And yeah, there are people in this field doing that kind of work, but there's a real need for more people who understand, as we're getting a lot of new data from sensors, from biometrics, from all the financial inclusion work. I think it's 97% of Kenyan households now have an M-Pesa account. That includes lots of families living in extreme poverty. They have access to these financial services on their phone. So all this data being generated by that. And we're still in the early going of both how to protect that data so people understand privacy and the regulatory side of this, as well as people know what to do with it to actually have real impact for families in need. So data science is a big area. There's an amazing organization, startup called Zipline, which uses drones to deliver blood to rural clinics. And these guys started in Rwanda, and I went to visit them recently there, and it's just incredible to see. They've got Rwandans who are, developing and assembling their battery technology and who really run the whole operation. It's also based in Silicon Valley, and they have engineers from other countries too. But, these are the kinds of people who, maybe in a former era, you would have had a much more analog approach to delivering blood. Now that it's this much more digital approach, you've got to train people and get people with the right technology skill sets at all levels. So it's just emblematic, I think, of the direction we're heading. And Zipline, by the way, very recently announced they're expanding into Ghana and North Carolina as their next markets. And they are $1 billion company now. They're a unicorn based on their latest funding round.
Brilliant story. And in that context, what do you? I mean, our little program here, our little series is premised on, like, what can we learn as practicing professionals in private sector from the work that's going on in the aid sector. And I know for a fact already that there's lots we can learn, whether it's being more agile or using what we have, and lots of things we learn. Do you think there's things that generally the private sector can learn from how the aid industry is responding to these forces of change?
I think so. Yeah. The thing about the aid industry, if you meet people who've done this work, even people who've been doing it for their whole career, they are used to handling incredible volatility. I mean, we're talking about doing work in countries where things shift very fast, where you might have no internet, no electricity, no access to clean water, no roads, very complex situations in terms of the local politics. And if you're in the aid industry, let's say you're in the humanitarian sector, you've got to get in there and save the lives of the people, no matter what. You got to figure it out. And so this is an industry where people know how to just get it done and figure it out one way or another. So you see, I think, a culture that the private sector could benefit from. Because often when I talk to private sector leaders, they sort of say, well, we pick our markets and we like to pick the conditions that we work in. So we're not going to work there or work there. But as the world globalizes, a lot of these challenges are everybody's, and especially big corporates that have supply chain issues that go into some of the most conflict-ridden countries in the world. They need to deal with this stuff. And there's a lot to be learned from the aid sector, I think, maybe more on the culture side and on the process side than in terms of, technology or data. I think that's probably more the domain of the private sector still at this point. But there's a culture and a mission orientation in the aid industry and a kind of get it done no matter what approach and mentality that's pretty powerful.
Yeah, the mission orientation is really interesting. And, like, companies are now increasingly being held responsible for their impacts on society. We're seeing that play out at Facebook and Microsoft and Amazon and so on and so forth. That's one really interesting thing. Also, distributed workforces and distributed operations is something that, is obviously going to be something for the future. Lutz Ziob, who's working on this series with me, says, Africa is the workforce of the future when you just look at the demographics as well. So we hope there's something we can learn through this journey, and it would be great if we really can. Can you, Raj, help people find or suggest some resources for people who want to understand more about the sector? And you should, of course, tell us how we can find out more about your book.
Yeah, well, Devex, part of our mission really is to help people understand this industry. So, and most of what you'll find on our website, the vast majority, is totally free content. So my recommendation, if you want to understand this space, is to just go to devex.com, read some of the news articles. We've got a daily newsletter called The Newswire that's free, and that gives you kind of the latest news. So it has, unfortunately, in this day and age, there's so much happening every day. There's a new, announcement about the U.S. government canceling aid to Central America. And that's the kind of story that you can read about in lots of media. But if you read about it on Devex, you'll get that kind of insider perspective. What do development professionals think about this? What does it really mean in terms of the actual operations in a country like Honduras or El Salvador. So I think go to our site. That'll give you a lot of good kind of basic background information. And if you really want to dive in, you'll find lots of resources there. If you're looking for a job in development, we have webinars and all kinds of resources for how to get a job in this field and how to understand it. And my book has now been out for a few months. The World Economic Forum named it their book of the month. I was just actually on NPR yesterday talking about it. And really my goal is to spark a real conversation. So I've written this for a broad audience because I think the aid industry, we need to see it as our industry. It's whether you're a voter or a taxpayer, you're an investor or a consumer, this matters. And so I think for your audience, I would love, even if they're not working in it directly, for them to see this as theirs. And that their voice and opinion on this really does matter. So I'd love to have them read the book and hear their take on it. The book, again, is called The Business of Changing the World. And the subtitle is How Billionaires, Tech Disruptors, and Social Entrepreneurs Are Transforming the Global Aid Industry. You can get it, at bookstores, at Amazon. You can just Google The Business of Changing the World and find the page of it, or look me up on Twitter and you can see it there on my Twitter handle. My Twitter is Raj_Devex. And I'd love to hear the take of your audience.
Yeah, no, honestly, it's a really fantastic read. It's pretty inspiring. We didn't dive into it here, but this sort of new breed of massively wealthy individuals are also really putting a stamp on how this works and demanding results in different ways. I think people are pretty familiar with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, but there's a whole crop of people who are coming with, frankly, staggering amounts of resource and demanding that things happen different. It's a great read.
There's one young couple I talk about in the book most people have not heard of, and they're already giving more than the Rockefeller Foundation, and I estimate they'll be bigger than the Ford Foundation within a decade. I've talked about some of those interesting stories in the book, and I think your audience will find them interesting.
Great. Well, one last question, if I can, Raj. I ask this of everybody who comes on our podcast because people who work in the learning space tend to be mission focused as well. And I like to ask people what inspired them to do the work that they do. Was there some event or some people or something that happened to you that led you to sort of dedicating your life to this kind of walking this tightrope between business and the aid industry?
Yeah, I had the good fortune. My dad is from India, and as a kid, even though I was born in the U.S., I got to spend a lot of time in India as a kid. I'd go there almost every year for a few months, and I had an aunt and uncle there who were development scholars and researchers, and they used to tell me a lot about development and even take me on some of their visits. I got to visit a dairy cooperative when I was a little kid, and I didn't realize it at the time, and I talk about it in the book. Only now have I realized I think it's now the largest social enterprise in the world. They do $5 billion in annual revenue selling, milk and butter and cheese, and it's from millions of Indian women farmers. So I got this taste of, when I was a little kid, of the big disparities in life, traveling from the U.S. back to India and seeing just the extent of poverty there. I used to play soccer with the kids in India in this little village where I was, and I'd be the only kid with sneakers on a gravel field, right? So I would see those differences and think, I've got to do something in my life that's connected to these issues. And then I had the good fortune of having this aunt and uncle who talked to me about what development actually is. And so I got a little flavor of it. And then I started asking those dumb questions I told you about as I got into grad school. So it's been a great journey. I wouldn't change it for anything.
Awesome. Well, Raj, thank you for the work you do, and thanks for your time today. It was really illustrative conversation. We will drive people to your website, and we'll drive people to your book, and we'll let you know what we find out about how things could be improved in the learning space in this sector too.
I love it. Thanks so much, Chris.
Thanks for listening to this episode in our special season of Learning is the New Working on the topic of learning for good. I'd like to thank all our participants in this season for sharing their perspectives and the amazing work that they do. I'd also like to thank my co-curator, Lutz Ziop, who brought amazing people to the conversation and a great fresh perspective for us. If you like the podcast, please take a moment to leave us a review on iTunes or on your favorite platform. Better still, drop us a line at www.learningfuturesgroup.com and suggest an interviewee or a topic that might help us point the way to the future of workplace learning. Thanks a lot, and see you in the next episode.